Hello everyone, my name is Husey, and now we are going to look at another horrific case with you. Monday, September 14th, 2015, was remembered by 16-year-old Nolan Buchanan as the best day of his life. The day before, he had spent Sunday with his girlfriend, a traditional morning mass with his girlfriend's family, followed by a get-together with friends and a wonderfully romantic evening. Waking up on Monday morning next to his favorite girl, the teenager felt like a free, successful, and influential businessman before whom the whole world was open. After all, he was now the owner of Buchanan. Nolan was detained at the Juvenile Treatment Center (JTC) in South Lake Tahoe until June 13, 2018, when an El Dorado County jury of 7 men and 5 women convicted Buchanan guilty of 3 felonies. The jury took only 2 hours to reach a verdict. The young man was sentenced to 150 years in prison with the possibility of parole beginning in the 25th year of his sentence. This is how his plan to take over the family business ended. Neighbors and classmates spoke of Nolan as a model kid and a good student. As far as I know, he was a good kid being a high school student camp. Campo Ruan would later remark in an interview that he always cared about education, he was extremely sweet, and he was quite kind. I'm even astonished he was caught. But what actually occurred in the Buchanan family? Let's go down this horrible case in depth. Molly first met Adam Buchanan when she came to apply for a job at his firm as an office manager. By the time they met, Adam was already divorced and raising his son Nolan from a previous marriage on his own. Cheerful, sociable, and cheerful blonde immediately attracted the attention of the owner of the company. The interest was mutual. Molly fell in love, began a courtship that developed into a serious partnership, and moved to Adam. Molly dreamed of a lovely, pleasant family and strove to create a fantastic relationship with her stepson until she fell pregnant. Gavin was born. People who knew the Buchanans reported that they were a reasonably close-knit family of 4. The leader of the family operated a construction company, made enough to provide a comfortable existence, and the family even acquired vacation property in El Dorado County, California, a little cottage sitting on 19 acres in Greenwood, a primitive cabin with no power, water, sewer, or gas. Adam, who worked in construction, took an active role in refurbishing the house, and the family began visiting it on September 13, 2015. At 10 a.m. Members of the Garden Valley Fire Department responded to a wildfire in Greenwood Township in western El Dorado County on Highway 193 between Coe and Georgetown. When they arrived, they found the fire had destroyed 10 acres of the property. A cabin located on the property was still smoldering but had burned to the ground. The fire department personnel observed charred remains in the ashes. The scene of the fire was not touched, and at 11 a.m. firefighters called the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. No one had yet realized what was at the scene, but firefighters were almost certain that the victim of the wildfire was a pet trapped in the house. The arriving coroner was faced with a daunting task. The remains of the house were still smoldering, and there was no way to examine the inside of the house. They had to wait for the flames to finally die down and the temperature toes. The coroner examined the house. He smelled the sweet odor of burnt flesh and later discovered a human skull and a burned chest, indicating that the tragedy had claimed someone's life. The officer requested backup officers from the sheriff's office, who arrived and conducted a thorough examination of the scene. The conclusion was obvious: the small, secluded, and remote cabin was not the primary residence of its owners, but rather a country cabin where people came to Virginia. It didn't take long to find out that the car and trailer belonged to Buchanan Construction, a firm owned by a man called Adam Buchanan. The individual in question resided 160 miles from the scene of the accident, around 3 hours away in Bonita, California. This information confirmed the assumption of the police, who decided that the house was just a country residence for those who vacation here from the hustle and bustle of the city. It remained to be seen who was inside Mr. Buchanan himself or someone else. The name of the owner of the company gave the detectives their first clue, with which they began their investigation. The Bonita police officers were tasked with checking to see if all of Buchanan's family members were well and at home. Adam's 16-year-old son from his first marriage came out. He greeted the uniformed officers with surprise and asked what brought them to him. The officers decided to first find out who was in the house so as not to frighten the household. Perhaps the company car had been taken by someone from the company rather than the owner himself. Nolan Buchanan stated that his father Adam had gone away for the weekend to his country estate 160 miles away with Molly and their 8-year-old son Gavin, and they were due back in the evening. According to him, his father had left him to look after the house. Investigators did not yet have sufficient reason to believe the remains in the cabin were those of the Buchanans, but the information received and the discovery of the remains believed to be those of two people fired the next day, September 14th. El Dorado County Police returned to Nolan's home to talk to him more fully and try to determine out who lived there. Claimed officers were met by Adam's parents, Howard and Susan Buchanan, who stated that their son, the owner of the burned-out cabin, does his own home repairs and thus travels there frequently. The parents were very concerned because they had not been able to contact their son or daughter-in-law until now. From the story, the officers discovered that the home was linked to generators, but there was no electricity at the time of the catastrophe. There were, however, gas cylinders inside, which provided two ideas. The fire could have been either accidental or intentional. According to Deaton James Peterson of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, by September 15th, the fire area had cooled enough for investigators to collect evidence, including debris from a nearby fire pit. New remains were discovered that changed the direction of the case. Police found a piece of skull with a bullet hole. At that point, we all realized that there was actually a homicide. This was not an accidental fire, reported the sheriff. The remains were collected and sent for forensic DNA testing in. The first set of remains, the bullet was lodged in the victim's thigh. The skull with the bullet hole, judging by its size, belonged to a child. The version of fatal accident dropped by itself initially. Detectives concentrated exclusively on the latter theory. They also investigated into Molly's background to establish whether she had any opponents capable of the murder. When those lines of investigation stagnated, cops switched their attention to difficulties in Molly and Adam's marriage, which turned out to be many. Investigators established that Molly and Adam's relationship began to deteriorate over time, and at the time of the murder, they had been sleeping apart for quite some time. A journal was discovered in which Molly recounted mistreatment from Adam. Witnesses interviewed reported severe treatment and abuse. Adam was not only harsh to Molly but also to the children. Molly's mother, Susie Slanker, admitted to investigators that there were times when I was afraid they would kill each other in one of their arguments. Molly did not sever her relationship with Adam, but would periodically take her son and leave to go to her parents' house and return a few days later until the next fight. It also turned out that the couple liked to hunt in the area where their country house was located because everyone was armed. Not investigators hypothesized that the weapon may have been damaged in the fire and might not have shown as visible as expected over the span of 5 days. Forensic team members took turns collecting ashes from the property. The search was performed with surgical thoroughness, but it did not give the expected result. No weapons were located in the premises. The examination proved that the DNA of the bodies belonged to Adam Buchanan, Molly McAfee, and their 8-year-old son. All 3 victims had suffered gunshot wounds before the fire, and the angle of the bullet wounds ruled out the version that someone took their own life. The lack of firearms meant that someone else was in the house, a 4th person who shot the Buchanans, and the investigation had to start over. Police had no choice but to turn to the 16-year-old son of the deceased, Nolan, who told officers that the family drove away in an old Dodge truck. When questioned why Nolan did not go on vacation with his relatives, the young man, like in the first interview, answered that he had a duty to care after the house and garden while his father and stepmother were away. Nolan also stated that they had a neighbor growing banned grass on the border of the Buchanan property, which led his father to have numerous fights with this neighbor, asking that he cease planting the grass and threatening to go to the authorities to discuss the family business. Nolan told of the company's financial difficulties. Things were not going well. The company was undergoing downsizing and the number of employees was down to 5 from what his father said. The debts associated with the business were rapidly increasing, so now the investigation had a lot of useful information and the detectives had to suspect a neighbor that, especially since violent crime was often linked to the cultivation.of illicit herbs. Detectives felt that the threat of going to the police could have led to the murder of Buchanan and his family. The problem was that no one knew which neighbor they were talking about. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing all the homeowners in a row. The tactic worked. They found a man who confirmed the story of a quarrel with Adam over growing a forbidden crop, but according to him, after a sharp conversation, the conflict was over. The neighbor had an alibi and Nolan's words were true. The company was in a sorry state. It was threatened with bankruptcy because the amount of debts exceeded $30,000. As a result, some employees were fired. It turned out that some of the former employees were extremely dissatisfied with the reduction and thus could be involved in the crime. That's where investigators got lucky. Over the weekend, the local high school organized a community cleanup day. The students were clearing debris from a business park. The discovery was significant because it meant that someone had traveled all the way to Greenwood to kill the family and then returned to Bonita to dispose of the bag and murder weapon. It appeared to be a Bonita resident. The proximity of the evidence found to the location of Buchanan Construction strengthened the theory that the boss was massacred by one of the disgruntled employees. Detectives submitted the pistol and the bag of documents for investigation, asking a warrant to check the company's records and premises. During the search, the investigators got fortunate a second time and received access to a video surveillance camera located on the firm's premises by fortuitous chance. The lens of the camera was directed not at the company's territory, but at the center of the parking lot. After this discovery, the case was just days away from being solved, because it was already known that the family had gone out of town on Friday. Investigators reviewed Friday's footage and were surprised to find that Adam had attached a trailer filled with rocks to a Ford F-150, not a Dodge truck as Nolan had told them. Detectives realized that the young man had deliberately manipulated the investigation. If the white Ford had towed the rock trailer to the cabin, then someone must have driven it back and parked it in the driveway of the Buchanan family home. Investigators re-interviewed Nolan, trying to keep him safe while getting as many details as possible. Nolan again recounted his weekend, where he had been and who he had seen, but this time they asked him what movie they had seen at the cinema. How Nolan responded with his father's credit card. The officers then applied for a warrant to search Buchanan's home in Bonita, search the vehicles, and check financial records. The Ford automobile was still parked in the driveway. It was closely inspected, and they noticed reddish soil sticking to the wheels, similar to that in Greenwood. If the Ford had been used for a trip last weekend or earlier, traces of soil might have remained, but they would not have been as obvious. Unfortunately, the fire detectives examined the bank card payments and discovered that Adam Buchanan used his credit card on Friday, September 11th, at fast food business Taco Bell on his way to Greenwood. Nolan, on the other hand, stated he stayed at home, did not accompany his parents, and had the credit card in his hands. Detectives went to the cafe and reviewed the video cameras. They saw exactly what they expected. When detectives searched the Ford, they found a Taco Bell receipt dated September 11th that included not 3 but 4 drinks. Evidence collected at the scene of the fire similarly pointed to 4 drink cups, indicating Nolan was in the car. The next credit card transaction took place on Saturday, September 12th at the Valencia Club Bar in Penan, about 30 minutes away from the cabin. Adam's parents had previously told detectives about the bar, saying their son, and on the day of the fire, a Ford F-150 proceeded toward the Buchanan cabin at 2:30 a.m. Then around 3:30 a.m., drove in the other way for the first time. The camera showed Adam and Molly in the vehicle, and in the second only Nolana. A few hours later on Sunday morning, September 13th, Adam's credit card was used to pay at 3 of Bonita's Starbucks, McDonald's, and a gas store, all corroborated to investigators that Buchanan only had one bank card. The facts contradicted Nolan's statements by the time forensic results had come back. Nolan's fingerprints were found on the gun, and he was detained in the middle of a high school class. Nolan Buchanan pled not guilty to the allegations against him. He sought to alter the incident and claimed that his father shot the family, following which he leveled a gun at him and, in self-defense, pulled the weapon away, accidentally shooting his father. Nolan said it was self-defense, attributing the fire and subsequent lie to a moment of panic and great fear, which is why he grabbed gasoline and lit the home on fire to make it appear as if nothing had happened. The defense repeatedly focused the jury's attention on Adam's maltreatment of his own kid and other family members. The medical examiner challenged the verdict because the bullet wound mark on a fragment of Gavin's skull was consistent with a shot fired at almost a 90-degree angle. Nolan, on the other hand, claimed that his and his brother's beds were next to each other and they were simultaneously awakened by the noise and screaming. It was at the moment of awakening that Nolan allegedly saw someone enter the bedroom and shoot Gavin. The shooter then pointed the rifle at him, and Nolan miraculously managed to push the attacker away. Under this scenario, the shot would have been fired at about a 45-degree angle, which was inconsistent with forensic evidence. Adam was killed first, followed by Molly Nolan, who then took the rifle, his parents' papers, doused the bodies with gasoline, and set the house on fire. He then went home, met his girlfriend, and spent the day with her, creating an alibi for himself. On July 13, 2018, a jury found Nolan guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 150 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Judge Kingsbury reflected on the verbal ant. The judge highlighted failing to obey guidelines and disruptive behavior. Staff at the South Lake Tahoe Juvenile Treatment Center, where Nolan went after his arrest, noted that everyone has the opportunity to change. Judge Kingsbury told Nolan, "I hope you will do everything in your power to do so. If you behave well, you will have a chance to get out on parole in 25 years under the Senate bill and Supreme Court rulings. It is up to you whether you take that chance or not." Nolan continues to say he is innocent. If he ever gets out on parole, he will have to pay a large settlement to the victims. The payoff amount is unclear at this moment. Thank you for watching, people. Subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell to not miss fresh tales from around the world. See you soon.